appointing the next person that the new Prime Minister has decided is to become the Governor General. But that's the worst possible person to give that kind of power to. In any case, that's why you have courts. That's why you have a legislature and an executive. My problem with that is because there's no distinction between them in practice. In small countries with tiny parliaments, there is no distinction. There is no backbench to talk about. But in theory, there's the executive, there's the legislature, and there's the judiciary. And the judiciary is separate, certainly, from the other two. So that all questions of law and constitution are finally adjudicated by the courts, right? And that is how you provide the check. But it does mean that when the law is passed, if it is vulgar and outrageous, then what you have to do is to file an immediate action, and ask the courts to hear it as a matter of priority. They have the discretion. If they feel that it's something of national importance, the courts can, in fact, have a hearing very quickly, But the fact of the matter is that it is only proper that a court decide what laws are on. Let me tell you another reason why. You have elections. Okay, we know the problem of five-minute democracy or 5-second democracy once every 5 years. We know that. But until we change it, as I suggested last week, to add to that, not substitute, to add to that, clauses in a new constitution that requires mandatorily consultation with the people before certain things can be done. Not all laws, not all matters, but like the budget and things of importance, interfering with the ecology of the country, conservation, the question of the environment, things that could affect it. Certain categories, it could be in a schedule of a new constitution that says certain matters must be first passed through a system of consultation, right? With particular bodies within the society, or by holding meetings that are duly set up in a particular way so that there's genuine representation of wide sections of the community to debate and discuss it before it can then be passed by Parliament after parliamentary debate. So I would say that would be an important provision, but we don't have it at the moment. And the fact of the matter is that what we have, therefore, is a system which, if there is to be rule of law, there has to be somebody who is the umpire for the match. And that is better placed in the courts than in a Governor General, given how the Governor General is appointed under the Constitution. So I hope I've been too long.
And if I'm understanding correctly, therein lies a huge problem, because over the last few years, we have seen, in particular, respectfully, this administration blatantly disregard the Constitution of Grenada and paying particular attention to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is now enforced because we are under a state of emergency. And given that we are under a state of emergency, what the Act provides is for fiscal rules and regulations to be suspended. I have an issue with that because if one looks at some clauses within the Act, it's unconstitutional, because Chapter 5 of the Constitution clearly outlines how public financing and how the government should manage the finances of the state of Grenada. And the clauses within the Fiscal Responsibility Act begs to question whether or not they're constitutional. You're looking at the unrest with the public workers and other workers with the government of Grenada. And here you are, I'm hearing our government using the Public Debt Management Act and other legislations to justify the inability to pay the agreed upon 4%, but yet for all, and I don't know if as citizens we are aware of that, in December of last year, our government went to the Parliament of Grenada and that I think is clause 10 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, activated that clause, which suspends all fiscal rules and responsibilities. But yes, they're saying, well, the fiscal rule and the space says we can't do it and we are not collecting enough revenue, which we understand. But when you look at certain clauses within the Act, we don't, as citizens, we don't have the resources to tap into the courts to get redress as relates to the constitutionality of the Act. And then my other concern is, as you said, there seems to be no separation of powers when it comes to who is within the court system and the judicial system. Over the years, while our government officials will not openly admit that, obviously, we have seen interference in the judicial system. So how do we as citizens how are we assured that if we ask for redress within the court, that it's going to be addressed? And the other question is, do the people within the judicial system, are they aware of the contents of the Constitution? Because that is another issue.
Well, you're not easy. You ask about 40 questions there. You're tough. And you read your clauses close and your laws. Let me start by saying this, that the extent to which there are any contradictions between fiscal responsibility or similar type of laws governing finances and the Constitution and the provisions of the Constitution regarding, for example, consolidated fund and how it can be set up, how it can be used, that all funds must be passed through it, etc., etc. That is a matter for the courts. I'll come to the other question about the questioning the independence of the courts. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'm just simply saying that within the constitutional architecture that we have, only the courts can decide that, so that there's only one way you can have any of the provisions of the acts you have described or act with various clauses described declared unconstitutional is by a court. So one will have to take action. No, I don't buy this thing about we don't have the resources to take it to the court. Because unlike America or even England, where it can be very expensive to take matters to the court, and in America, that's why they developed decades ago a system, I think, applies both in civil and criminal matters, where you can go to attorneys, and not all will agree to that, but many do, where they have what they call a contingency fee. They will take your case, charge you nothing, but if they win for you, they take half the money, half the settlement you get. If you're lucky, they take 30%, but most of them will take 50%. So you have that. And I think within very recent years, even in the Caribbean, the contingency fee thing, which was considered unprofessional and unlawful, I think is now accepted. Even, I think the rules, the professional rules have been changed with respect to that, even in our part of the world. However, you have enough lawyers in Grenada that will take the case, charging little or nothing, So I don't think that is where the bottleneck is. The bottleneck is now, how will the court look at it? And yes, courts do have a tendency to be a little deferential towards government of the day. They tend to be a little deferential, not always and not fully so. Look, the CCJ just ruled against several members of parliament, cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister of Dominica, in an election petition. Well, strictly speaking, it was not an election petition. It was actually something involving the elections. A claim that the governing party, many of its members, had in fact brought free drinks and food and live free entertainment at political meetings during the election campaign, and that would have influenced the voters. And so they took criminal prosecutions through the courts, the magistrate court, against them. This was thrown out at High Court, but the appeal court reversed that, and the CCJ upheld what the appeal court had done and struck down what the High Court had done. So that, in fact, the government and members of parliament on the governing side in Dominica are now up in arms about this. They say this is a terrible precedent that the CCJ struck. Now, that doesn't sound to me too much like a court at the highest level within the region being enthralled and subservient to the ruling party, right? And in fact, that same CCJ has ruled against the government of Belize on 3 occasions. So much so that the Prime Minister of Belize, about 3-4 years ago, I remember him making a statement saying that they still very much support the CCJ, and they stay with them and they encourage others to join it. And then he added with a smile, even though every ruling has been against us for a number of years. So I think it's a bit more complex. I'm not saying they're not individual judges who, shall we say, are, let me put it delicately, are malleable, whether because of too much political deference or for whatever other reasons. But I think the court system as a whole has not done badly. There are exceptions, I agree with you. And in fact, one famous jurist in Britain, I can't remember, one of the big names, made a statement many years ago, and it was echoed by somebody of similar stature in the United States too. I forget which of them would have been the first to say it. And it goes something like this. The real test of judicial independence is when a court rules against the governing authorities, the powerful, whether they be the business class or the political elite or whoever is the most powerful forces in a society, rules against them. And secondly, rules against what is popular opinion. In other words, where most people in the country stand on an issue, whatever the issue is, and most people are fiercely for a particular position, and the courts rule in another direction, which means they will incur the opprobrium of the people, right? And when therefore in situations where it's unpopular or politically risky for a court to rule in a certain direction, but does it? That is the real test. That is the acid test. That's at the extreme now. How do they do when they're under incredible pressure, either from the ruling elites, which is more than just the political class, but also the business class, or the population as a whole? It could be the stand on abortion, it could be the stand, the issues that, can arouse great passion. And that's the ultimate test, okay? But generally speaking, I know that there are threats. For example, to give you one example that supports your concern, there was a case where one particular judge, a Grenadian by the way, ruled against a particular government in a particular island, not Grenada, where she was, in fact, the High Court judge, the only judge. And constitutional matters came as well as strictly legal matters, but all to do with elections and the power of government and so on. And she ruled 2 or 3 times against that particular government. The Prime Minister of that country took it very personal. And when she reached 60 years of age, the public service, the Judicial and Legal Commission, regional, decides on appointment of judges. But when a judge reached retirement age, which is 60, or I don't know if they've changed it recently, it was 60, it probably still is. Not at the CCJ level, it's higher at CCJ level, but at the regular High Court and Appeal Court level. And she applied, as she's entitled to do, for a 2-year extension beyond retirement age. All the prime ministers but one turned her down. I leave you to guess who turned her down. And so she had to come back to Grenada and the government give her some job or something like that, okay? So you have a situation where if you're getting close to retirement age and you feel 60 is kind of young, and I would really like to continue my career for a few more years, if you have made rulings that hurt a certain person, you could be in some difficulty. I know another judge, he was Grenadian too, and he was stationed in St. Vincent, he ruled against the government. Within no time at all, he was transferred to Dominica. He ruled against the government there. He was transferred to Montserrat. And, it was like that. And he couldn't make it onto the appeal court until years later, in changes of government, he finally made it onto the appeal court, many years later. So you do have situations like that, but we have to take the total picture. And what is more, as I said last week, bear in mind, at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with human beings with all the strengths and weaknesses that we as human beings have. And these human beings make up the institutions. And sometimes the institutions are not independently strong enough in the face of malleable or weak individuals. But the ultimate test, the ultimate guarantor or lack thereof of constitutional rule, the people. If the people, as I said last week, are not conscious, are not mobilized, are not fighting for their rights, and therefore they lose them, who is to blame? We could say this politician and that politician and this judge and that judge. But ultimately, the citizenry are the only real guarantors of any constitution. And therefore, fundamentally, the constitution has to be within our hearts and minds, collectively, as a people. That's the only ultimate guarantor.
All right. Cassandra, switch over to Brother Ned.
Okay, good morning to everybody. Once again. Very interesting discussion this morning. And I the whole discussion on the Governor General, the duties ascribed to the Governor General has been one that has been of concern to the Constitutional Caucus for a while now. For us, the Constitution in Section 23 establishes the Governor General as the head of our legislature. So any law that has to be enacted, it is established that in addition to the Senate and the House of Representatives, Her Majesty is represented. And Her Majesty's representative is given a very specific duty. So in Section 45 of our Constitution, that duty that is ascribed to Her Majesty's representative and the Parliament, by extension, gives the legislature the authority to make laws. The Senate and the House and the lower house to discuss the bills, and the Governor General to assent to the bill. So I still struggle with the perception that the Governor General has to assent, because for me, Section 45(2) of the Grenada Constitution clearly articulates when a bill is submitted to the Governor General for ascension, in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution, he shall signify that he assents or that he withholds assent. So this is not an ambiguous statement. The Governor General has the authority to assent to the bill or not. And as head of the legislature, that is one of the duties that's ascribed to her. And the role of the Governor General, again, is very pivotal in this Constitution, because she is not just only the head of the legislature, the entity that makes the laws, but she is also, by virtue of Section 57, by virtue of Section 1, she is the executive authority. The executive authority is vested in Her Majesty. She is also the head of the government, the organs of government, the cabinet. So I continue to struggle to put all of this together. And for me, it signifies simply that the Governor General has a very specific role to play. And she is put in a position where she does not run the legislature, she does not run the executive, but she's put in a position where she has the authority to make sure that those organs are run according to the dictates of the Constitution. And that is a question that I would want to ask, you know?
Yes. Well, that's deep. That's deep. But let me put it this way to you. We have to look at this thing in broad historical terms. Remember, there was a time, and remember, we have our Constitution coming out from the British, from British colonialism. And it is invested with their thought process, their culture, their political culture, their imprint, and their imprimatur. They're the ones who gave it to us, imposed it on us. We had very little say as a people in drafting it. So it's important to understand their historical background. Remember that there was a time in Britain when the monarch had absolute power. Absolute power. Now, that was the system then. And at a certain stage, and for centuries, the monarch was both the head of the courts, in a real sense, as well as, of course, the legislature and the executive. Now, as you know, in 1215, the Lords, because there was no broad democracy at that time, but the Lords basically held down the monarch with swords and made him sign the Magna Carta. Some call it the Magna Charta. I'm not sure. You know, I've seen it spelled both ways and I've seen it pronounced both ways, which provided certain rights and powers. Not for the masses then, but it has in fact since evolved as rights of the people as a whole. So I only make that point to say there was a time when the monarch had absolute power in all matters. And then the process starting in 1215 was one of eroding that power. By the time you reach 1688, with the so-called English Revolution, that, of course, was a fundamental departure from what went on before. But what am I getting at? I'm getting at one thing. The monarch, throughout British history, and I might say several other countries too, although they have now become republics like France and Germany and others, the monarch is a creature of genetics, of inheritance, one family, birth determined. Do you want a system where birth determines who runs the country? If you were to give the kind of powers to the monarch as you are in fact advocating or suggesting is what is existing in the document, and not your personal opinion, but your reading of the document. Remember that the Governor General we have is a creature of a system of determined by birth, in that the monarch is the monarch's appointed representative in Grenada. So for as long as we have the Queen of England, or the King whenever Prince Charles takes over, you have a system that is determined by birth. One family by birth. They have done nothing to get it. It's not like some countries that have an elected president, but rather birth, and birth alone has determined the head of your legislature, if you are to read the Constitution in a non-formalistic way. And then remember, secondly, what I said before, which is that the Governor General can be removed at any time at the whim and fancy of the Prime Minister. So that's not really in the picture. Okay, so I can say, I refuse to sign this bill. Okay, how many days before he or she will no longer be able to refuse because they have been replaced by somebody who would sign it? So that's really, I'm suggesting, not an answer to our problems. I would like to suggest respectfully that perhaps we need a head of state, if you want a ceremonial head of state, if you don't want an executive prime minister, an executive president rather, you can have a head of state who has the same functions of a governor general or a queen, but is elected in some way by the people, so that they have an independent base. And on that basis, and I would not give them the power to veto. I wouldn't give one person, man or woman, the power to veto what the whole parliament, elected parliament, has decided. I would say, give them the power to withhold for 90 days and to trigger a consultation with the people. And if it's very important, to trigger a referendum. In other words, you could have a power that is short of the absolute power to veto what everybody who has been elected by the people has decided, but rather the power to delay and to force consultation. There's some ideas to think about.
Well, for me, I don't look at it as a power to necessarily to veto, because if she is carrying out her duties or constitutional duties, then she has the duty to ensure that the bills are in fact done in accordance with the Constitution. Now, if it is, the section 40, section 45, section 40, 45 again, right? The bill must be submitted to the Governor General for assent,
Right.
in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution of Grenada.
Right.
So the bill must be in accordance with what the constitutional instructions, the constitutional directions are.
Right. True.
Now, if the Governor General, in her own determination, in some way figures that this bill clearly violates certain aspects of the Constitution, then she has the right not to assent to. Veto might be a strong word.
Let's agree to that. Let us agree to that. Here's the problem. It's the Prime Minister who effectively appoints the Governor General. So that's the problem.
So hold on. Because our Constitution sorry, is a system of checks
No.
and balances. All right. Now, when you remove layers of scrutiny, you leave the Constitution now vulnerable to abuse. So the Constitution gives the Governor General the authority to make certain decisions, and if she, you know, those decisions are not made, then the Constitution itself loses authority. And we keep saying that, okay, it is the people. The Constitution is a document, like any other document. And if the Constitution, it does not have feet, it can't get up, it can't walk. We, the people who have agreed to these rules, and I'm saying so that we have in general, as a people, agreed to the principles that this Constitution was founded on. We have a belief in God, we have a belief in the rule of law, etc., etc. We think that we are all equal, and that our patrimony, the resources that we have, must be shared equally among us. Those are the founding principles of the Constitution, the basic beliefs. So when we start to isolate and we start to cherry pick issues out of the Constitution, and you don't look at the Constitution as an entire document, I think it becomes very vulnerable and open to the kind of abuses that we now see.
But you see, I disagree with you about the checks and balances. There are very few checks and balances. That's the point. There are few, right? The courts are the closest we have to checks and balances in the system, because as I pointed out, there is really no check and balance between the legislature and the executive. The legislature is in practice a creature of the executive in terms of the real exercise of power, because there's no difference. There's no real difference between the legislature and the executive, right?
But that's again,
the ruling party, almost every member of the legislature is a member of cabinet or a vice minister. So that's the first problem with checks and balances. I'm not talking about the Constitution does. I'm talking about what happens in practice under the Constitution. Okay. Secondly, also under the Constitution, the Governor General effectively is a creature of the Prime Minister. So we back to see this is a question of the power that the office of Prime Minister has within our distorted system of Westminster. As I explained the difference between how the executive and legislature relate in the Westminster model with 650 members of parliament versus Grenada with 15 or other islands with 13 and whatnot. So my point is that there are no checks and balances between Prime Minister, Governor General, legislature, and executive. The only check and balance we have in practice is the courts. We don't have any other in practice. No, that's why I said to you, if we were to change the Constitution so that the head of state, even if you still call it Governor General or President, whatever you call it, is appointed differently by election. They have to be elected directly by the people, or they have to be elected in some manner, so that it's an elected position, not one chosen by one man, the Prime Minister. Elected, then that person would really have a greater possibility of, in fact, saying, well, no, I don't consent to this because I think this is unconstitutional. In other words, even if you have the right thing in the document makes no sense if you put somebody with the power to appoint someone who will not carry out what is in the document. That's the problem of the lack of checks and balances. So you read clauses of the Constitution without asking yourself, who is the power that appoints the people who are supposed to carry out these clauses? And you're back to the fact that there are no checks and balances.
So the question now arises, if the Governor General fails to carry out her prescribed duties in the Constitution, what is the recourse?
The only one is the Prime Minister. If they're doing what the Prime Minister wants, and it's only the Prime Minister who could fire them, don't you see what's going on there? There's no checks and balance, none.
No, but again, our Constitution, Section 108 of our Constitution, right, speaks to questions which shall not be inquired into in a court of law. And one of them is if the Governor General has carried out her duties according to the Constitution and requires the advice of the Prime Minister, requires the advice of the Cabinet or anybody, that shall not be inquired into in a court. However, if the duties that she's supposed to prescribe she's supposed to carry out according to the Constitution, and she does not do it, nothing, according to what I'm reading here, nothing stops the court from inquiring into activities that would be unconstitutional.
Right.
So there are checks and balances.
Hold on my sec. No, I don't agree with you at all. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
Because the Prime Minister, if he is unhappy with something that the Governor General has done, and he won't take it to court, because I agree with you, certain sections say it cannot be inquired into. He doesn't have to take it to court. He writes.
No, but I'm not referring to the Prime Minister at all. I'm referring to John Public. It says here the court is a final appeal.
Oh, well, then that's not an argument, because as I say, the Governor General in effect serves at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. That's the reality. That's the reality. That is why there's no check and balance.
So what would be the political fallout? For instance, if a Governor General cites that a particular law affects the rights and privilege afforded the general population, and the Prime Minister fires that individual, what would be the public response? So there will be a political cost.
Right, exactly. That is the point. The people level of consciousness and organization is the ultimate guarantor of whatever constitution you have, whatever the constitutional document you have, whatever its contents. Ultimately, only the people, their collective wisdom, their collective consciousness, their collective level of organization or lack thereof, it will determine the issue. Nothing else. Nothing writing in the document. It depends ultimately on the people. Absolutely. That's my whole point.
And herein lies that encapsulates the focus of the Constitutional Caucus, because we are of the opinion that our Grenada Constitution, and we accept whatever our history is, but for the purposes of going forward, we would ask the question, what do we not agree with in this Constitution? And if we agree to the foundation principles, then why can't we go ahead and do whatever amendments, adjustments we want to do as we go along?
Yes.
So this Constitution, it has been hidden from us. And because as a population, we don't understand our rights, our freedoms, those rights, those freedoms are now being disrespected totally. And we don't even know what is sad about it is that we do not know that we are in fact being disrespected when our constitutional rights are being trampled on. And I mean, it's been done in mass. The constitutional right to a pension, for instance, that's being trampled in Grenada as we speak. Now, and those are the constitutional provisions that have been afforded the Grenadian people. So clearly there is, I'm happy that this conversation is taking place, and I want us to look at it as a discussion. Because ultimately we want to agree on things that would serve us better in the future. And that's the whole perspective. That's the whole rationale behind these engagements, that we must come to accept that if we have agreed on these rules, and by and large we have, the Grenada Constitution has been brought to the people on 2 occasions for referenda, for change. There were sweeping changes included in the Grenada Constitution. It's very, very deep, with a lot of consequences, changes that were advised on. And the Grenadian public said to them, no, let's leave the Constitution as is. So fine, we now have a document that we have agreed that this is what we want to work with.
Mhm.
For how many years, in the future, whoever wants to change it again still can.
Right.
But we now have to start to talk now about giving that document the force of authority that it's supposed to have. And the problem that we're seeing here is that if we selectively, because of custom, because of practice, say that, okay, that is how it's done. That is how it's done, and it may have been done for 20, 30, 40 years, but it's done wrong, in contravention to the oath that as public servants and elected officials that we all take. So that's the concerns that we have.
Yes.
Right.
You made an important point when you said earlier that ultimately misdeeds by any government, the ultimate sanction is political cost. But the political cost is going to be low if people are not conscious.
Yeah.
And high if people are conscious. That's why I keep on saying, no matter what is in the document, no matter how laudatory the actual document is, no matter how many checks and balances you put into it, ultimately, as you pointed out, what price or what cost a particular governing party in any of these territories has to pay is determined by the people, the political cost, the next election, or whatever. So that ultimately, what restrains governments from going too far and ought to restrain them from going far at all is public consciousness, public arousal, public organization, and the public willing to, in fact, take sanctions in the form of ballot box.
We are presently under a state of emergency that, according to this constitution, should have been proclaimed.
Right.
The Governor General by proclamation. We have not seen the Governor General in months.
Mm.
In months. So it brings again to the fore checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
The state of emergency is supposed to be declared according to Section 17 of the Constitution. It's a very clear direction. And if it's not done that way, is it a state of emergency? And are the actions now?
Challenge it in the courts. That's the way to deal with that. You challenge it in the courts. How else can you do it? By the way, let me give you an example. In the Gary period, 1974 to be precise, January, February, March 1974, with 25,000 people in the streets chanting, "G.O. go, Gary must go." Remember those days? Or you want to lie?
Yeah, I was one of them, yeah. I remember that.
No, man, you were a teenager, man. You
Joking making.
all right.
But
Now, remember.
But I also sang, "We'll never let our leader fall." Eh?
Right, no matter. That's fair enough. No, that's fair enough. That is your political right. Here's my point. At a certain stage, Dame Hilda Bino, the Governor General then, decided she could take no more of what Gary was doing. And in fact, she came out with a public statement that didn't attack him, but which objectively sided with the people. And guess what? Within days, she was on a plane back to Trinidad. Right. And Gary appointed a new person, right? What's his name? He was a big plantation owner, estate owner.
Leo DeGale? Was Leo DeGale?
Leo DeGale, right?
Oh, yeah.
Who was one of the political foes of Gary back in 51. But anyhow, the point is that that's the fate of Governor General, who has reached a point where they can't take any more of what whoever is the Prime Minister is doing. That's the fate. She would have been told. She would have written a letter to the Queen asking her removal and putting Leo DeGale. And it was done very quickly. Within days of her making a statement on the radio, she was on the plane back to Trinidad. That's why I'm saying, ultimately, you're right. Political cost is the only effective constraint against the power of any government.
All right. The time is now 11:30. Come on, I could have about half an hour to go before we get out of here. I want to ask a question. Well, Ned kind of glass over it a bit. Comrade Code, you have been the single-handedly put NIS together. There's a lot of talk about the NIS and how it should be functioning. Could you give us a little synopsis on the functionality of what your idea was when you put the NIS together?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that the International Labour Organization must get the credit for the technical work that was done in devising the NIS. They have done that for many countries around the world. And they first went to Gary. They went to the Gary government before the revolution and said, look, we think it's time for you to put an NIS in place. All the other Caribbean territories, or nearly all, I think all but one or two, already have an NIS. So that, you really need, it's important for the people because the overwhelming majority of Grenadians have no pension, nothing at all. So only civil servants and only established civil servants have a pension. The rest of the people, the overwhelming majority, have no pension. And that cannot be in a modern society. Very response, and this is what the ILO technical people who came now during the revolution speak to me as Minister of Finance. And they said, I'd gone to Gary, and his response was, yeah, it's a great idea, it's necessary, but by political cost it's going to be too high. I'm not quoting his exact words, but, that's what effectively they were told. But when you go and take 4% out of people's salaries, right, and the salaries are already low, people are going to make a lot of noise, because remember, 4% comes from the employer side, 4% from the worker side. I'm talking about the conception at the beginning. And so he says, boy, in this time of recession, again, he wouldn't have used the term recession, but the economy was slowing down. Agriculture wasn't doing too well. There wasn't much tourism in those days, and so on. There wasn't much manufacturing. There wasn't much of an economy. Mostly people living off remittances. And remittances under Gary, the last year of Gary was 14 million EC dollars. First year of the revolution was 42 million. So even remittances weren't doing too well under Gary. And so he said, boy, politically, I'll be in trouble if I take 4% out of people's salaries. So that is what, of course, meant that it was never set up under Gary. I thought I should give you that background. First of all, that the technical work, not all of it, but the heart and soul, the core of it, had been done by the International Labour Organization with experience doing this around the world. Secondly, that the Gary government, for reasons of their assessment of the state of the economy at that time, and the fact that it would be politically very unpopular to take 4% out of very low salaries, decided not to implement an NIS. So then they come to us, and we look at it, we examined it. And my position was, supported by the entire cabinet, was, listen, we have to start getting the economy moving, and as soon as we can do that, we implement it. First year, second year, our average growth was 3% of GDP every year. 3% of GDP every year. I'm talking about real growth. Wages went up in the first year by 17% in money terms, but after you take inflation out of it, which was 10% inflation in that year, workers got on average 7% real income increase. In other words, income that could buy more things, more in the basket of goods. The second year, it was 3%. The third year, it was 4%, and so on. So there was growth. And then secondly, because employment went down from 49% down to 12% ultimately, it meant that more people, there were more individuals in each household earning income. 700 people working at the airport. Okay. X number of people working on Eastern Main Road Phase 1. Farm roads, feeder roads, this, that, the other. In other words, because of the increase in employment, it meant that where before you had one person in a household earning an income, you now had 2 and 3 people in the household earning an income. So in a situation where there's a lot more household income, in addition to more real income for each worker, now you could talk about taking 4% because you're taking 4% out of a bigger pie. So the timing of the NIS was April 4th, 1983. And we used the period from 80, 81, 82, 1983. The first 3 years, we laid the foundations in terms of raising real incomes, in terms of raising household incomes, and then we set up NIS, implemented NIS. In the meantime, the work was being done. And I must again give credit to a guy called Christopher Ram, an accountant, an outstanding accountant from Guyana, who we employed. We brought him in to help us in the Ministry of Finance in a number of capacities to do with accounting, and in particular this. And in fact, I gave him the mandate to go in and actually set up the NIS using his accounting skills. By the way, that's why I always laugh when I hear all sorts of other people claim, I am the one who set up the NIS for coding, or I'm the one who did the work, I'm the one who did this. And it was a guy called Christopher Ram. Anybody who claims it other than Christopher Ram, just have a good laugh, okay? He's the man who actually went in and did the technical work, obviously with a team of people, but he was the head of the team. And so that's how the NIS was set up, and that's the timing as to why it was set up when it was, and not before, right? You can't take money out of people with very little income. When their incomes are rising year after year after year, then you're in a position because you're taking out a slice out of a much bigger cake. So that is the context, and that is the timing of the NIS. Now also, there's another side to this thing, a very important strategic side, and that is, within a few years, the NIS had 500 million EC dollars in its reserves. And it reached a stage where it had, a few years ago, $1 billion. About a year or two ago, it reached $1 billion. Can you imagine that? An economy of the size of Grenada. You know, that's a huge amount. That's like trillions of dollars in the American economy by comparison. So that, in fact, that money now could be used for developmental purposes. Unfortunately, during the era of this, they raided the NIS. I was very upset. They raided the NIS to pay salaries. Now, that is craziness, if you'll forgive my language. That's craziness. If you put up housing units and either sell them to civil servants, workers in the private sector, whoever wants to buy, you sell your houses to them or you rent it to them. Whichever way, money is coming back to replace the money you borrowed from the NIS to build the housing. Whether it's coming back in rent or it's coming back in mortgage payments, in other words, you're recreating the money. But if you just take it and pay salaries direct with it, gone for good. That's the end of it. So unfortunately, the NIS was raided a number of times by governments in a way which was harmful strategically to the NIS. And that is very unfortunate.
Another question for you. Somebody just calling in here from England.
Sure.
My next question to you is then, given the present situation in Grenada as it is to teachers and the union and stuff like that, how do you see the NIS playing a better role in the government control and distribution of wealth in terms of the retirement packages for retirees?
Right. This is a very important question. Remember, when the NIS was set up, we were faced with difficulty. The only people at that time who got a pension, the only people in the whole of Grenada who got a pension were civil servants, what they call established civil servants. Not everybody working for government, you know. People working on the roads, people working on government farms, people, you know, who are the janitors and the cleaners and so on, and the stewards and the, you know, the people like that. They got no pension, you know. It was established civil servants, the one wearing jacket and tie, in other words, to put it crudely. They're the ones who got pensions. No. And teachers and nurses and people like that. No. So what we are doing is providing a pension for the entire population. What we did was we put a clause in the law, clause 45, I think it's number 45, subject to correction, which said that at any future time, you wouldn't have to go back to Parliament and change the law or amend the law. The Minister of Finance or the Minister of Social Security, I forget which one, the minister involved, the minister responsible, could, by declaration, by gazette, in fact, increase the pension for public workers, because we're starting with a system there, they are getting paid. And under the same law that set up the NIS, it said that all existing civil servants, everybody who was working for the civil service up to that point, even if they were hired one day before the law came into effect, were entitled to the full civil service pension that had been there from before. Only people hired after that date. And the idea would be that nobody hired after 4th of April 83, none could be retiring for another 20, 30, or 40 years. So they had 20 to 40 years in which to build up what we call in economics a sinking fund that would in fact make up the difference between the NIS pension and the pension that civil servants in the past and up to that date were getting.
Wow.
Successive governments chose to do nothing for the 20, 30, 40 years. As remember, I say if a person of 18, 19, or 20, or 22 was hired in the civil service on April 5th, 1983, they would not be retiring at the age of 20, they're not retiring for 40 years. If they hired at 25 years of age, they're not retiring for 35 years. If they even hired at 30 years of age, not retiring for another 30 years. Therefore, there was enough time to build up a sinking fund. Every single government did nothing about it. And instead, as I pointed out, one case of a government that just simply raided the NIS to pay current civil service salaries instead of investing the money and using the profits, the income from the investment, to pay civil servants more and to put some in a sinking fund. Therefore, when the crisis comes now, 30 years later, some unscrupulous people want to say it's the PIG fault. And they conveniently don't tell civil servants there's clause 45. And it could have done something about it. Look, they hadn't go to Parliament, they haven't got to pass a new law. They don't have to amend the law. They don't have to put a new clause in the law or change any clause. There's a clause built into it. In other words, we saw the problem. And our plan was to set up a sinking fund. But remember, the invasion came 6 months after the NIS was set up. So that never happened. So that's the background to the situation. And there's no alternative. If you are to properly recompense the public servants, you have to set up a sinking fund. You have to set up something, in other words. And it can take different forms. It can take the form of investments. And you don't touch the investments. You don't touch the dividends or the interest, depending on what the portfolio of the investment is. Let it build up so that you'll have enough money at a certain critical point in order to pay future civil servants the correct amount. So you may have to take out of the budget, existing budget, in the meantime, but you're setting it up so that so many years down the line, you no longer have to take out of the current budget. You'll have a sinking fund that will provide money. It's a question of proper financing planning.
Wow. Now, so given that information that we have now, what should the people of Grenada now expect, or what they should be, what course of action should they take now to ensure that this is implemented?
Well, you're asking me a very ticklish question there, because you're not asking me a constitutional question. You're not asking me an economics question, which is really my field. I'm not too strong in this constitutional business.
Yeah.
But you're asking me a question that is fundamentally political, which I'm staying out of.
Okay. Don't have to answer that. Don't answer that. Don't answer that one. Don't answer that one. Right? Before you be charged.
I've given you the technical answer. I've given you the financial answer to how it can be financed. But I don't want to give you a political answer.
Yes. You'll do it next time. Now, I want to go on to the next question, because I know you have to go in 50 minutes. You have to go. I know we spoke about your involvement